Hi, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video we're going to talk about the esophagus. Our objective here is to dive into the anatomy of the esophagus's muscle layers. We're going to talk about what peristalsis is specifically, and we'll talk about how it's accomplished. And then we will talk a little bit about sphincter muscles and the roles that they play in all of this. Thus far, we have made it through the oral cavity and the pharynx. So we are picking up here in the esophagus, and that is going to carry us all the way down through the thoracic cavity and into the abdomen. Again, like the pharynx, the only digestive process going on here is going to be mixing and propulsion that's going to move the ingested bolus down to the stomach, where the magic can start. The esophagus itself isn't terribly fancy. It is just a simple muscular tube that connects the pharynx to the stomach. Each end is guarded by a sphincter muscle, which can open and close when it's not being used for swallowing. The muscularis layer has two distinct layers, which is pretty normal for a muscularis. We have a deep layer made up of circular fibers, and then we have an external layer made up of longitudinal fibers. Those two layers of muscle are going to work together to actively push food down toward the stomach. Now, the esophagus itself is a transition zone where we're going from somatic tissue or skeletal muscle to visceral tissue or smooth muscle. What this looks like, practically speaking, is that there's a gradient of muscle type. So the first third of the esophagus, I should say the proximal from the oral cavity, from the oropharynx down, is going to be skeletal muscle. The second is mixed, and then the end toward the stomach is going to be entirely smooth muscle. And while the contraction of these muscles will actively push a swallowed bolus down, there is also a good deal of passive transport happening thanks to the mucosa that lines the lumen of the esophagus. So the epithelium here secretes mucus, which is important to help lubricate this pathway. A lot of what we swallow is only roughly broken down, and there can still be a lot of friction. This is also why the cells of the epithelium are in a stratified squamous arrangement. So the overlapping layers of cells give the deeper tissues some extra protection from all the things sliding over the top of them. The pattern that the circular and longitudinal muscle layers fire in to push that bolus of food down is called peristalsis. So in peristalsis, the first thing that happens is that these circular fibers up here are going to contract, and that is going to push that bolus down. Next, the longitudinal fibers, so those are the ones running the length of the tube here, are going to contract. That is going to shorten up the esophagus, and it makes the tube wider to help the bolus slip down a little bit more easily. It also has the effect of pushing more of these circular fibers closer together. And if you think back to MSK, the easiest way to produce a stronger contraction is to use more muscle fibers, right? So that gives the circular fibers a little bit of a boost by putting more of them in a smaller area. All right, this pattern is going to continue all the way down. So we get contraction of the circular fibers, contraction of the longitudinal fibers, and it'll repeat as often as necessary to push that bolus all the way down and then into the stomach. At the end of the esophagus, the distal end here, just before it meets the stomach, is the lower esophageal sphincter, also called the cardiac sphincter because it sits in very close relation to the heart. A sphincter is a ring-shaped muscle that often guards the end of a tubular organ. It pinches it closed to keep the contents inside the tube. So we're going to be encountering quite a number of these as we make our way through the digestive system. Now, when muscles contract, they get smaller, right? So if we arrange a muscle in a ring, that ring is going to be largest when the muscles are relaxed. So we've got a good example of this with the pupil of the eye here, okay? We have a sphincter muscle that changes the diameter of the pupil, sphincter pupillae. So when this is relaxed, we have a nice wide pupil. When these fibers contract, that ring gets smaller and the pupil gets smaller, so this whole diameter shrinks up. So if we're using these as gatekeepers in the digestive system, they relax to open the pathway and they contract then to close it up. That means that they're typically contracted, right? And they only relax every now and again to let something through. Now, the reason that I bring this up is that muscle tissue is pretty easy to injure, and the organ directly below the esophagus here makes its own hydrochloric acid. So this lower esophageal sphincter is often very clinically relevant. So if you have overproduction of acid in the stomach, the sphincter muscle can get burned. And if it's injured, it doesn't close properly. And that can allow some of the stomach acid to travel all the way up into the esophagus and potentially wreak havoc all the way up to the nasopharynx. All right, this is why GERD or acid reflux is so common. All that needs to happen here is that this little sphincter muscle does not close properly, and then it's easy for acid to escape from the stomach. All right, that is going to bring us to the end. The esophagus may be long, but its section here is very short, so thank you for joining me.